Okay, good. All right. Okay, you guys. We would love to have lots of dialogue in this one. Any, inspection issues that you have had that you can share. I'm going to share my screen right now. But then we're also going to share, we're going to kind of go through a quiz, and then based off of that quiz, I've got the answers already, but sharing some real life examples based off of the answers. So, so we'll get going.
Yeah,
so again,
what I think the main idea of this is it's always probably the most difficult part of any transaction, from offer to closing table. And it's sometimes a time for buyers to think that they can renegotiate price or renegotiate the terms and things. And so we wanted to provide just an open platform for you to share some of the challenges that you've had. And we can kind of keep the conversation flowing to help you understand all of your obligations and rights in an inspection contingency and protecting your client.
Right. And so hopefully some of these questions then will just spark questions among you guys as well. Right. We'll get right to it. So the questions. The seller has the right to cure. Buyer delivers a notice of defect within the deadline, and the seller does not want to cure. What is or are the proper ways to terminate the offer? So number one, if the, again, seller does not want, slippery hands here. So seller does not want to cure. So if the seller does not want to cure after a notice of defects has been delivered, okay. If the seller does not respond and the 10-day, what I call election to cure period comes and goes, the deal then is null and void. So again, once that notice of defects is delivered and the seller has the right to cure, then that election to cure period, which defaults to 10 days in the offer to purchase, begins. So then the original inspection deadline is kind of out the window now. And then this 10-day period where the seller can do their own investigation can come up, they can do their own investigation, I should say. And then, determine within that 10 days whether or not they want to cure the defects or not. Per the contract though, if that 10 days comes and goes, the offer is null and void. If the seller knows right off the bat that they do not want to elect to cure, they can deliver their own notice back to the buyer right away with their intent not to cure, stating their intent not to cure, but it must be delivered on a notice of defects. And then also a seller may just offer a cancellation agreement right away to the buyer. And if the buyer signs it, then the offer is terminated as well. Joni, any follow-up comments?
Yeah, I mean, these are all the answers of what the seller has to do to terminate the offer. If the seller just is silent and doesn't do anything, and that period comes and goes like number one says, it is null and void, but it doesn't actually terminate the offer. You have to do that with the cancellation agreement and mutual release. Oh. So technically and prudently, the seller then should deliver a notice to the offer, not a notice of defect, but a notice of offer to purchase to the buyer saying they're not going to cure. And that triggers the delivery of a cancellation agreement, mutual release. Okay. So that is a terminated offer when the seller had right to cure and decides not to cure.
Okay, good point. Okay, so follow up to that though. Seller has the right to cure. Buyer delivers a notice of defects within the deadline and the seller wants to cure. What is the proper way to communicate this to the buyer? So tagging along to what we were just talking about, seller must deliver a notice back to the buyer within that quote unquote election to cure period, stating their intent to cure, that they still elect to cure. So I have an example of this. We had a case last fall where a buyer delivered a notice of defects to a seller, and their intent was to get out of the offer. They were hoping that the seller was going to choose not to cure the defects. The buyer wanted to get out of the offer, and they had communicated that. The seller, though, did choose to elect to cure the defects. And the listing agent emailed me with the seller's intent to cure. She just gave me an email back saying the seller will cure the defects. Long story short, the buyer waited through this 10-day period. They were still very much wanting to get out of the offer to purchase. Attorneys did get involved, or were consulted, I should say. That this entire time, though, we never received a notice back from the listing agent, from the seller, properly communicating to us that they wanted to cure the defects. So that 10 days came and went. We never received that notice from the seller that stating that they elected to cure. Then on day 11, we wrote a notice back, letting them know that the offer was null and void due to the fact that the 10 days came and gone and we did not hear from them, along with a cancellation agreement. And the sellers had to sign that cancellation agreement, and the deal was then dead. So this is a cautionary tale when you are on the listing side of this, that if your seller wants to cure the defects, that you are making sure that you're reading the contract and properly communicating that to the buyer and their agent.
Stephanie.
Yes.
So all you need to do on the selling side is initial that notice of defects that they had sent and initialed, correct? And return?
Nope.
No, okay.
The seller's own notice needs to come back to the buyer. If they're electing to cure, they need to send a notice back, just simply stating seller elects to cure defects.
Yeah, they send a notice either way. Either they elect to cure or they are not going to cure within the 10 days. And remember, when they elect to cure, that means they have to cure every defect. They can't pick and choose. There's no negotiating, as you know, in notices. So they either, yes, they're going to cure, or no, they're not going to cure. But that means all the lists of defects to which the buyer objected.
Okay, and I think I was confused. I'm also thinking of when you get an amendment to the offer, and so that would be different than the notice of defects, and that's where you would just initial.
The amendment is for talking back and forth. The amendment is for negotiating. And then when that doesn't work, then that's when the notice of defects come out. And the right to cure is not triggered until a notice of defect is sent. So there's no such thing as right to cure when you're just in the amendment stage of, and that has to be done all within the inspection contingency deadline. So once that deadline of the inspection contingency is coming up, you either have to agree on an amendment or start with the notice of defect.
And I think some of these questions will address that as well. So we'll be talking about this still.
So Joan, do you want to then communicate with them first? Like, hey, we have a list of like all those defects, but we want to communicate like back with you. Can you guys do at least like 6 of those 10 and then just request the 6 and not do the whole thing? Would that be better?
Yeah, and in the amendment, you can decide with your buyer what's really important that they want fixed. And then you send how you want it fixed, who you want to fix it, that you want lien waivers, that you want invoices, all of those things in the amendment.
Okay.
If the seller never responds or doesn't agree to that, then your only choice left before the inspection contingency run out is to do the notice of defect. And there you can only list the defects that you either want the seller to cure or he doesn't have the right to cure.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, as Joni and I are constantly saying about in terms of the inspection contingency, I mean, the notice of defects is always the final line in the sand. You're always making an attempt to talk and come to a meeting of the minds with the seller on buyer's requests through the vehicle of an amendment. So many amendments might go back and forth. And you guys may not come to an agreement. And then again, that's when the notice of defects is delivered. Does that make sense? All right. Next question we have. Buyers had a home inspection and now they want to, I'm missing a word here, go on the property again. Do they have a right to further inspections? Yes, and they have a right to that if the home inspection report, keep doing that, if the home inspector recommends in the home inspection report that the buyer may have follow-up inspections on any components or areas of the home. So that again is spelled right out in the inspection contingency. So if, for example, the buyer has a general home inspection and the home inspector recommends having the chimney further evaluated and writes it in the report, then at this point, the buyer may go ahead and have that follow-up inspection based off of the general home inspector's recommendations. That being said, though, seller still needs to approve any follow-up inspections, like the timing, and they must be made aware of when the follow-up home inspection is happening, or the follow-up inspection, I should say, is happening. So my cautionary tale on this, we've had very angry sellers who have, and this is just a coordination detail, where listing agents have communicated back to buyer's agents that yes, okay, that follow-up inspection is fine, and confirmed it too quickly, and chimney person went out to the property and the seller was not made aware, and there was a very angry seller. So again, kind of the caution here is that when we are trying to set up these follow-up inspections, we're very much relying on the contractors' schedules. They're very tight schedules, and trying to coordinate many schedules is very hard. So again, kind of in the interest of time, getting contractors into these homes in a timely manner, because remember, all this has to happen within that inspection before the inspection deadline. It's just a word to the wise that we are making sure that we're right-sizing expectations with our sellers when we're presenting these offers and pointing out the fact that this might come up. So just, again, properly warning sellers or making sure that they understand that this piece of the inspection contingency can move very fast, and that as a seller, if there is a follow-up inspection called out, we need to allow that person in.
Right. So. Most of the questions that any agent or buyer is going to have about inspections is actually in the inspection contingency. You just have to read it very carefully and not gloss over some of the lines. On line 200 to 202 in the inspection contingency in the residential offer, it says buyer may have follow-up inspections recommended in a written report resulting from an authorized inspection, provided they occur prior to the deadline of the inspection contingency. Inspections shall be performed by a qualified independent inspector or independent qualified third party. So yes, they can have follow-ups, but make sure that it's coming from the inspection report in writing.
Awesome. Yeah, and I don't have keep that language up because we might need to refer back to the inspection language. All right, next question. All right. Buyer had 12 days for any inspection. I feel like I'm missing words here. Buyer had 12 days for an inspection and any follow-up inspections, and conducted a roof inspection within the time frame. The roofer stated that the roof should be replaced within 2 years. The buyer proposed an amendment asking the seller for a roof replacement credit. The amendment had a binding acceptance date after the inspection contingency deadline. When seller did not respond, buyer delivered a notice of defects and cancellation agreement well after the contingency deadline. Why is this not effective? Biggest one, number one. Notice of defects was submitted after the deadline, so the inspection contingency will be deemed satisfied. They missed the deadline. So once that deadline comes and goes, then the buyer is proceeding through the offer as it is. Submission of an amendment has no effect on the deadline for the notice of defects. Again, that notice of defects has to be delivered before the inspection contingency deadline is up. And then the inspection report was not submitted. So this is just a comment that when you're delivering a notice of defects, the inspection report is always attached with that notice of defects. But back to what Joni was describing before, and our last line in the sand, this is where the notice of defects comes into play. Like if you're not able to come to an agreement with the seller, or if the seller is not responsive and you're at 7 p.m. the night of an inspection contingency deadline, at 7 o'clock you're delivering that notice of defects if you have not heard from them. If the buyer does not want to move forward on the deal, if nothing happened with the repair requests, then that that notice of defects needs to be delivered. So again, otherwise they're buying the house as it is.
That's probably one of the scariest situations an agent can get into and it's one of the first questions I ask when somebody has a question about inspection contingency. I ask, what's your deadline date? And it's amazing how many agents go, oh, I'm not sure, let me check. I mean, that date should be tattooed on your forehead.
Yes.
You really have to keep track of that date, because if it's not, if you haven't figured things out either through an amendment or send over a notice of defect, it's too late. And that's the answer to this question. It's too late. And you will sometimes get some sympathy from the listing and the seller and saying, oh, well, we can still negotiate this, but rarely. And it's too late, and the seller has sold the house to the buyer the way it was before the inspection. So keep that.
And, again, your contract to close processes, should include putting these deadlines on your calendar. I just cannot stress that enough. So, and not just beyond the inspection contingency, all of the deadlines per the offer to purchase should be going on your calendar. All right, next question. The seller had the right to cure. Inspector found that roof needed repairs and the chimney flue was cracked. Buyers did not submit a notice of defects and instead just told the listing agents what the defects were. Buyer then decided that they did not want the house and asked for their earnest money back, citing the roof defects. Will the buyers get out of the contract? And we just said it simply, no, there was no notice of defects delivered, so the buyers accepted the property as is. We don't need to beat that again. If the offer falls through, what does the seller do with her copy of the first buyer's home inspection? And the answer is to use this as a basis for amending the real estate condition report. So we get this question a lot. And actually, I want Joan, I think, to comment more on this. As far as agents' duties when buyer does not, or I'm sorry, if a seller does not amend their real estate condition report. So oftentimes if an offer falls apart, there's an inspection report available. The seller will amend their real estate condition report and just cite the home inspection and attach the home inspection. To me, I think that's the easiest thing to do. And I don't know if Joni has any differing opinions, but that's what I see most often, is that the seller will just attach the condition report.
Yeah, some sellers are reluctant to send over the previous inspection report, and they can just amend the property condition report if that's what they want to do, as long as they're amending everything new that they discovered when the inspection was done. So every little thing in the inspection, reverse pull or whatever, has to be amended in the property condition report. And remember, there is an amendment to the property condition report. You don't mess up the original one, but you add the amendment to it. Questions have come up, well, the seller doesn't want to do it because that's their private information, or that's their possession. And that doesn't hold water, because in the offer to purchase, it clearly says that inspection report is delivered to the seller promptly, whether there are any defects at all. But then that becomes actual knowledge to the seller that they have to disclose one way or the other. So the seller can share it. It's not private information, it's disclosable information. And your sellers, if you have a listing, your sellers are obligated to disclose everything that they know about the property. And every time there's an inspection done, there's always new information that comes up.
So can they just put the inspection then in documents?
Yes, they could. Yes.
Yeah.
If they do that, they have to obviously cross off the name of the first buyer, black it out. And any other personal information that would be on that report has to be taken out.
All right. Okay, so the real estate condition report says that shingles on a roof are raised and the buyer signs the real estate condition report. Buyer has shingles inspected by a roofer as a component inspection. Can the buyer list the shingles on a notice of defects or an amendment? So answers. Yes, the buyer can address the shingles on an amendment. So what I always say in regards to this, And a lot of people have questions on if something is disclosed on a real estate condition report, does that mean that a buyer cannot ask about them or attempt to negotiate on those things? Buyer can very much still attempt to negotiate on any item that comes up, or something that is named on the real estate condition report. It's all on how the seller responds, of course, but something named on a real estate condition report does not preclude them from attempting to negotiate on it. Second response, yes, in a notice of defects that the shingles problem was worse than what was revealed in the real estate condition report. So this is where nature and extent of the issue would come into play. And then, but also no, if they could not put it on a notice of defects if the buyer knew the nature and extent of the issue. So I'll have Joan give her example here.
Yes, the phrase nature and extent is a legal phrase, and we use it when we're talking about defects on a property. Let me find what I was looking for. When we're talking about defects in a property and how they are disclosed to the buyer ahead of time, either in a condition report or something they see and are made aware of when they're looking at the house. But this was a story that was in Legal Hotline about they had a leaking porch. I think it was a flat roof porch over a screened in room in the house. And on the seller's condition report, it said that I'm aware there's a leak in the roof over the back porch when it rains heavy. And that was how it was disclosed to the buyer. And then the buyer signs the offer, has the inspection done, and with the inspector then goes out and sees that it's not just it leaks when the rain's heavy, but that the whole underlying levels of the flat roof are totally destroyed. They're all crumbling and cracking and everything. And some of the felt is exposed. So that would be a condition where the nature and the extent of the problem is much worse than what was implied in the condition report. That it leaks just when the rain's heavy is very different than the whole underlying materials for that whole roof are destroyed and crumbling and need replacement. So the seller said, well, you can't object to the leaking roof, or you can't object to the porch roof because you were known about it. And the buyer's response is that we didn't know the nature and extent of it. It was much worse. And so it went to court, and the court agreed that the nature and extent overrides the fact that they had previous knowledge of something, and let the buyer get out of the contract. One thing I want to bring up on that, if you remember the lines, I always forget them, I always have to look it up. But in the inspection report on lines 210 and 211, I had to write it down, so I remember that. It reads, for the purpose of this financing contingency, defects do not include structural, mechanical, or other conditions, the nature and extent of which the buyer had actual knowledge, which is an important phrase, or written notice before signing this offer. That means anything that the buyer was made aware of, as long as it fit this nature and extent limits, that the buyer actually was made aware of, or given written notice, like in the real estate condition report, they can't use it as a defect. One method as a buyer's agent may be to strike lines 210 and 211. So that means even though you were made aware of a certain condition in the property, and you may have negotiated it in an amendment, as Stephanie said you can do, you can still use it as a defect in the notice of defect. So it gives you a little more wiggle room, but in this era of protecting your client with buyer agency, If you don't have buyer agency, I don't think you're really allowed to put that in. But if you have buyer agency, I would definitely consider striking those 2 lines so that you can call a defect whatever is a defect in the property. Any questions about that?
I've been seeing that, this is Annie, I've been seeing that more and more lately, that there is, like the Germantown office, it seems that they're using that as standard protocol, that those 2 lines. And so they pretty much can go after anything then, that it doesn't matter what's in the real estate condition report. So
exactly. They can go after it by naming it as a defect.
Right.
I had a situation a long time ago. I just told this in my previous meeting. We were going over the offer to purchase, but I had a listing and it had a really badly cracked driveway, which you could see, the buyer could obviously see it, but it was also in the condition report that there were shifting concrete and all that. And so I got an offer on it, and the buyer ends up writing a notice of defect. And one of the defects was the severely cracked driveway. So I said to the buyer's agent, can't use that, sorry, it was in the condition report. And he said, well, then you didn't read my offer very carefully, because on line 210, he crossed off the word not. He didn't cross off the 2 lines, he just crossed off the word not, so that it read, defects do include structural, mechanical, or other conditions that the buyer is made aware of. And he was right. I didn't see the word crossed off, the little word not. But it is something that as a buyer's agent, it gives your buyer more leeway to really decide whether this house has defects that they can live with or not.
But it also may make the seller, when they're looking, if they're having multiple offers, if that's on there, that may could bounce you right away, because they know that you might be looking for something, correct?
Correct. And you will know, because at that point you're sitting down with your client, writing the offer. You most likely have the condition report in front of you, and you can decide at that point, this looks a little suspicious. I'm not really quite sure, that I want to accept this. Then you can do that. You can cross them off. You really want to protect your buyer's rights and look into it. Or you can see, these aren't really big things that I would probably call out, or I'm not going to give a notice of defect because I really want this house, and all those other conditions.
All right. Next question. Seller has the right to cure. Buyer delivered the inspection report and a notice stating that there were issues with the roof. But the buyer wants the crawl space inspected because water was observed inside, and that the buyer wants to terminate the offer. What are the pathways in which this can be addressed? So kind of a few things going on here. A notice of defects was sent. So then the election to cure period kicks in, and the seller may elect to cure or not elect to cure or do nothing, as we've previously commented on. 2, the buyer may have the inspection of the crawl space, but the statement on the notice was not necessary. So this is kind of a conflicting notice of defects, in my opinion, because they want to get out of the deal. They didn't necessarily need to say that they want the crawl space inspected. They didn't need to say that the crawl space should have been inspected at all. Again, we can go back to the original contract on that. And to have follow-up inspection is already there per the original offer to purchase. And then addressing the fact that the buyer wants to terminate the offer on this notice. If that is what the buyer's intent is, the agents can recommend to the parties that they seek advice from their own attorneys regarding the legal effect of the notice. So, in this case, the seller has the right to cure. So a notice of defects should have just been delivered, naming the defects that the buyer objected to, with nothing concerning the buyer's request to, or desire to terminate the offer, nor did they need to, again, say that the crawl space was to be inspected. So if the ultimate goal of the buyer is to get out of this offer, and if you guys had come to us with this kind of question, Joni and I would have to say that you guys would need to seek, or that the buyers and sellers would need to seek advice from an attorney. So
yeah, in any situation where a buyer has a contract in place, and say the contingencies have been met or not in dispute, we cannot give any advice to a buyer on how to get out of a contract. We can say, well, let's look at the financing. Maybe you can get a financing refusal or something like that. All of that is a violation of your license. You could lose your license over it. Those are definitely legal. That's legal advice. Those are legal questions and legal answers. And it's something that we really have to always catch ourselves. Are we just advising based on the words of a contract? Or are we giving our own opinion on what the client should do? And it's very easy for agents to get sucked into this, especially the more experience an agent has, where they've seen this happen before. You know, like I'm sitting here with a lot of years doing real estate. I've seen this happen. I've seen it, and it would be easy for me to say, oh, based on this happened, you can always do this. I can't do that because I am giving legal advice. So we always have to stop ourselves short and question that effect or not.
One quick question. Do you, if inspection happens, do you have to do an amendment before you do a notice, or can you go straight to the notice?
Well, if you want to negotiate, you have to do an amendment. If you want to just kill the contract, especially if the seller doesn't have right to cure, and you're just saying these defects are too much and this is over, you can go straight to the notice of defect and list them. The amendment is only for negotiating back and forth and setting terms and wishes and wants, but none of that can be addressed in the notice of defect. Only list the defects, and if the seller doesn't have right to cure, that offer is done, null and void.
All right, and I think we're gonna get to that right now, actually. Buyer delivered a notice of defects to the seller listing repairs to be done and describing how the seller was to cure the defects. Should a notice of defects or an amendment be used if the buyer requires the seller to use specific carpenter or contractor to repair the items? Answer, if the buyer wants to have the repairs done in a certain manner or by certain contractors, an amendment must be used because a buyer cannot unilaterally dictate the terms. So back to what Joni just said, if they want to, if we're negotiating and they have their own ways of how they want the repairs to be remedied, then you have to ask for that in an amendment. But back to if a notice of defects is served and buyer does want to dictate, then that conversation needs to be happening at the time that the offer is written. So we have a note here for a clause that you can put in the offer to purchase when you're giving the right to cure to your sellers. And this has to happen and be agreed upon during the initial offer negotiations. So to help protect your buyer in this case, you could use this language. Seller shall have the right to cure in a good and workmanlike manner using professional licensed experts with the benefit of permit as required and in accordance with municipal building codes and generally accepted construction and safety standards. The scope of work shall be defined by an independent third party, for example, a structural engineer or roofing consultant. So if that clause was written into the offer to purchase and the seller had agreed to it, and that notice of defects was served, then we have to default to this clause language, and the defects have to be, again, cured in the good and workmanlike manner. And it gives a little bit more, what's the word I want? Just more clarity on how—
Direction, yeah.
Thank you, on how the defects are to be cured. Because otherwise it is, in my opinion, it is vague. So any other follow-up comments, Joni?
Yeah, this clause I think is in our library somewhere. I think it's office library in zip form. I was only made aware of this clause only about 5 years ago, and it was like, wow, is that smart? Because you can't ask for that when you're giving a notice of defect. You can ask for it in amendment, but when you're serving the notice of defect, you cannot tell the seller what to do. So putting this in the offer up front, if you're giving notice to cure to the seller, is a fabulous idea.
All right. Next question. Who must, and we addressed this already as well, but who must receive a copy of the inspection report the buyer received from the home inspector? The seller. Regardless if they are given a notice of defects or not, they must promptly receive a copy of the inspection report. So in your practice as buyer's agents, just making sure when you receive that home inspection report from the buyer, or sometimes you're CC'd on those emails, shoot it right off to the seller or to the listing agent. Likewise with any follow-up inspections. Seller deserves a copy of anything done to their property or assessed.
Yeah, and promptly is important, because some agents think they have to wait till they write the amendment up or even the notice of defect, and then they attach the report to the amendment. It really should be delivered to the seller right away and not wait for an amendment to be drafted or a notice.
And you do not have to get buyer's permission. I was always told you had to get buyer's permission to send it.
The buyer's given permission in the offer.
Okay.
And just a follow-up comment, I mean, it serves everybody well for everyone to have time to process these inspection reports and read these inspection reports. I have seen that it's in some agents, they feel like it's strategic for them to deliver the inspection report along with the amendment, as Joni commented. I think that we're trying to head off problems here, and I think that just creates more headache. You know, give everyone time to review these things.
Mm-hmm.
All right, seller has the right to cure. Buyer delivers a notice of defects to the seller. Seller objects to the notice, stating that some items listed are not defects. What is the proper course of action? And speaking to attorneys is the proper course. But Joan, you had an example in this one with the cedar.
Right. In fact, when we were reviewing the offer to purchase last hour, this came up again. We really can't say if a buyer objects, a buyer cites a defect and a seller disputes it, the seller's always right. Or we can't always say that the buyer's always right and overturning what the seller thinks. We can't say that because it is a legal answer and a legal solution. And actually most of them can be handled in small claims court. But I had an actual story where the buyer, it was my listing, and the buyer cited a defect on the south side of the house. It was cedar siding, and it had started, some of the siding, very small amount of the siding had started to curl up the bottom from exposure to the sun. And they cited that as a defect. And as I said, it was a very small amount. So my seller objected and said, you know, they actually flatten out and, you know, when it cools down or in the winter or whatever. Anyway, it did end up going to small claims court because the buyer buyer's notice of defect, that the buyer thought that was a defect to their owning that house, paid considerable weight to the judge when they were deciding one way or the other. Now, we also heard when it went to court, the judge said the seller's proof of something not being a defect overrides the buyer's proof of something being a defect. The point is that a judge can go either way. And so never say to your buyer, oh, if you object, it's a defect. If the seller overrides you, it's not a defect. It has to be, it really has to be ironed out with an attorney if it gets to that point. What you can discuss as agents, listing agent to buyer agent, are reports. You can get reports that this is, you know, from an engineer or a roofing contractor or something, that this is their opinion, and then you can get a conflicting report from the seller that says it is not a condition, and negotiate from there. And a lot of times that can be negotiated by maybe the seller giving the buyer a little bit of credit or something like that. But that all has to be done in the amendment stage and not the notice of defect stage. When they're in the notice of defect stage and they're conflicting opinions on whether it's a defect or not, like Steph said, call your attorney.
Okay, I think we're getting close here, guys. I think that was the last one. I just had one more final closing thought, and just always to be clear with your language. I think even in the amendment stages, there becomes, I just handled a question this morning. Even in the amendment stages, there are questions. It's not just the notice. Just really spelling out if a buyer wants something to be completed, either referencing an estimate or clearly dictating and spelling out to the seller how you want something to be remedied. I thought of an example from last fall where one of our agents wrote in her buyer's amendment, inspection amendment, that the fireplace just be clean or inspected and cleaned. And of course, there was issues. It got executed. There were issues when this fireplace got inspected. There were repairs that needed to be done, but the seller or the buyer's agent didn't clearly communicate that, have inspected, make any recommendations based off of that inspection, and then also have it to be cleaned. So seller just has the fireplace inspected per the request, and they followed the contract and had the fireplace cleaned, chimney cleaned. But those repairs, there was objections to having to do the repairs because it wasn't clearly stated that those repairs should have been done. And, you know, I think any person, reasonable person would assume that yes, any repairs that come up based off of that inspection should be done, but it should have been spelled out. We need to spell it out. And even if you—
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah.
The other thing you want to avoid is vague language, like to buyer's satisfaction or things like that. They have the problem and the resolution have to be clearly described. You just can't say to buyer's satisfaction or whatever like that.
And then just to tack onto that, I mean, when you guys are going and negotiating your inspections and you need help with contract language, come to us before your buyers are signing them. So we can help you draft that language to make it as clear as possible. All right, does anyone have anything to share? Any follow-up questions? I'm gonna stop share here. No?
Excellent class. Excellent, excellent class. I've been in the business for a year and a half now, but I learned a lot of things. So thank you. Maureen won probably a year ago. I don't know if you were there, Steph. She gave she did a class on just filling out the offer to purchase and what clauses that they put in. And it was so excellent.
Sure.
Just to hear from a seasoned agent on what the standard things they do. And so
sure, yeah. Or like acting as a buyer's agent, like with Stale, for example. I know that back to the lines of 210 and 211, when they're acting as buyer's agents, they will always cross those lines out. I know that's in a few of their practices for sure. So that's good feedback, and something that we can coordinate again for sure. So
and because I'm new here, I'm trying to familiarize myself with ZipForm to begin with, and going through the clause library and all the different clause libraries that they have, that ZipForm has, and that Keller Williams has also added in their office clauses. So I went through all of those. That I never had that resource before. Where I was before, we had .loop and it didn't have a clause library. I had my trusty WRA clause book. It's really valuable to look through those clause libraries and see that, but the office library has things like that, a right to cure, where the buyer, where the seller has to do it by certain instructions and things like that. But a lot of very good clauses in there for you to just plop right in your contract.
We could probably do a training just pointing all of those clauses out.
Mm-hmm.
So
great.
Okay, anything else from anybody? All right, I'm glad that this was helpful. I think as Joan and I were discussing, it just helps to like put this all in context versus just going through the contract language, like giving examples of how these things get played out. So, all right, thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, good group, thanks.
Yeah, great group. Thanks a lot, guys.